Hello and welcome back to this COMET-Farm training where I'm demonstrating how to create a new project using the hypothetical Chico State Carbon Farm Plan for reference. If you've not yet reviewed the introductory videos as well as the creating a new project video, I highly recommend going back and starting there. From here on out, we'll be going through how to enter our historic management and baseline management. The first thing you want to do on this page is make sure you select the field that you'd like to start entering data for. So in this case, we're going to start with our orchard. Next, under historic management, you're going to see that there are three questions. The first one being, what was your pre-1980 management? One of the most popular questions we get is, what if I don't know how my land was managed prior to 1980, which is a totally reasonable question. The good news is that it is just a drop-down menu, so we're asking you to select the option that best represents how the land was managed prior to 1980. If you really have no idea, you can try reaching out to your local extension office or resource conservation district to see if they have any insight. In this case, I'm going to select cropland irrigation as the pre-1980 management. Next, you'll be asked if this field was enrolled in a Conservation Reserve Program or CRP prior to the baseline period. In this case, remember that my baseline period is beginning in 2012, so anytime prior to 2012 was it enrolled in our CRP, and I'm going to answer no. Next, you'll be asked from 1980 to the beginning of the baseline period management, what management was most appropriate. So again, in this case, we do have a drop-down menu. You're choosing the option that is most representative of how your land was managed, and this is from 1980 to, in my case, 2012, but in your case, it might be a different year. It's the start of your baseline period. And for this field, I'm going to be selecting irrigated annual crops with hay pasture in rotation. Once you make that selection, you're going to get one final historic management question, which is about from 1980 to the beginning of your baseline period, how was your field tilled? In my case, I'm going to select intensive tillage, but the options also are reduced till and no till. Now that you've completed historic management for your first field, you can of course proceed to select your next field and replicate these steps. However, one shortcut is this button that says Copy Historic Management to Other Fields. If you have multiple fields in the same zip code that are all managed historically the same, this allows you to copy the management that you just entered to the other fields, saving you the time that it would take to go through and do this manually. Of course, there are going to be instances in which your fields might be located in the same zip code but were managed historically differently. So of course we don't want to do that in that case. But for this particular circumstance, for the Chico State Carbon Farm Plan, we are going to assume that the orchard, pastured, and crop fields are all historically managed the same. We're going to press copy, and it'll take a minute just to load, and then to double check, I'm going to go click on the pasture, and we'll see that that management got copied over successfully. And with that, we can go ahead and proceed down to baseline management, or on this page, it's step 3. Again, you do want to make sure that you're selecting the field that you'd like to enter management for. So in this case, we're going to start with crop because I think it's the most complicated to enter management for, and so it's the best to start with. Scrolling down, you're going to see all of your baseline years listed here. So in our case, it's from 2012 to 2024. In order for this step of the project to be considered complete, meaning in order for us to be able to proceed past the baseline management, every year in this baseline has to have management entered. At the bare minimum, that means that a crop has to be planted during that year, but in our case it's of course going to be a little bit more complicated than that. A workaround in that regard is that fallow can be considered a crop that's quote-unquote planted during a year. So at minimum, a crop has to be planted every year in your baseline in order for this section to be considered complete. I'm going to start by showing you how to add a crop manually, and then we'll go back and use the crop rotation builder to show you a quick shortcut. Looking at this crop list, you'll notice that it is not an all-inclusive list of every crop you can possibly think of. We are of course limited in terms of what crops are included in the Blue Book, as well as what crops have been parameterized in DACENT. There are some crops that have surrogates, so for an example, trit is not included in the tool, but winter wheat is modeled quite similarly. There are of course some crops that are just not available, nor do they have a good surrogate. An example of that would be onions. If that's the case, do reach out and let us know, as we keep an ongoing kind of laundry list of crops that people are always asking for, and that hopefully someday we can get included in the tool. So do reach out and let us know if there's a crop that's not included. Using the Chico State Carbon Farm Plan as reference, we're going to start with alfalfa in the first year of our baseline. So we're looking at the year 2012. This first panel is where you're going to include data for your planting and harvest of this crop. And again, this is alfalfa planted in 2012. At minimum, you need to have a crop planted, so the very first question is going to be about your planting date. You can use this calendar to select your planting date. In my case, I'm going to say my alfalfa was planted at the very end of October. You'll have the option with perennials to continue that crop from the previous year, which I'm going to go ahead and opt to do. And once you make that selection, it is going to be grayed out for you to include. Next will be a harvest date. This is of course optional. There is a little trash can icon if you do want to not include any harvest information, but for this alfalfa, I'm going to have my alfalfa harvested February 15th. This next option is going to be to select if a grain, fruit, seed, root, or tuber was harvested. For alfalfa, the answer is no, but for something like corn, the answer would be yes. The following box is dry matter removal, and what that indicates is separate from the grain, fruit, seed, root, or tuber that was already harvested, what dry matter was removed from the crop. So in the case of alfalfa, I'm going to put that at 50% residue removal. The last question in this panel is about the yield. And you might notice a superscript here with some fine print. And that's because the yield that the user enters is only going to impact your results if they also include a biomass burning event. This is because otherwise DASIN is going to parameterize its own yield based on other data that you've entered. So again, the yield that you as the user enter is only going to impact your report if you also include a biomass burning event. I don't plan to include a biomass burning event. I'm going to put the yield at 1 ton per acre, but of course this is not going to impact my results. The next step in our baseline management is going to be to define our tillage system intensity and other field operations. So you'll notice that we have pre-planting, season tillage system intensity, and post-harvest. And of course, from these drop-down menus, you are welcome to select your tillage system intensity. However, there is categorization in terms of that intensity, which is defined in this little question mark. So you can figure out what your tillage category is based on that tillage system intensity range. We don't expect all users to know that, so we've also implemented a tillage intensity calculator. What this does is instead it includes the implements and then can automatically define your tillage system intensity based on those implements. Because this is a perennial for alfalfa, we don't have the option to include any pre-planting tillage, but for our post-harvest tillage intensity, I'm going to select a V-Ripper as our implement, and you'll see at the bottom it defines that as a full intensive till category 2. And when you say populate intensity, that's going to be brought over to the main panel. Under Add Field Operation, this is where you would have the option to include other field operations such as growing season cultivation, mowing, burn events as well, including tillage events that you want to happen during the growing season. Next, we'll move on to the application of fertilizer and/or organic amendments. This blue bar at the top is going to total your nitrogen applied across both fertilizer and organic amendments. And while ultimately we're not going to add fertilizer to this alfalfa, I will kind of walk you through the panel. The first thing you want to do is select your fertilizer type, and based on that selection, a couple of these components are going to auto-populate. Then you can opt to either enter your total amount applied or your total nitrogen applied, and those will populate based on the other. So when I adjust the total amount applied, it'll adjust the total N applied. When I adjust the total N applied, it'll adjust the total amount applied. And again, you'll see that blue bar gets updated. Then again, for just the sake of presentation, I'll go down and add organic amendment. Similarly, once you select your amendment type, a couple of those values are going to auto-populate to default. You can, of course, edit them. And then once you update your fresh weight applied, that is going to update your total nitrogen applied in the blue bar at the top. So again, across both these two, right now we'd be adding 324 pounds per acre of fertilizer and organic amendments totaled in terms of nitrogen. We have also added the ability to add biochar to your field. Again, I'm not going to be adding this to my alfalfa, but just wanted to give you a visual. And next we'll move on to irrigation. When you hit add irrigation event, there are two ways that you can add irrigation. You can either manually enter your irrigation events or you can automate. So for manual, you're just going to select a start and end date where I'm going to have mine start February 15th when my alfalfa is harvested and have it go over until around mid-October. For irrigation amount, this is in inches per application. I'm just going to keep that at 1 inch per application and go 6 days between applications. You can also, like I mentioned, choose to automate where you have a start and end date and then just a target field available water holding capacity. I usually keep that at 55, but you can of course edit that to be whatever you'd like. For the sake of this demonstration, I'll keep this as manually entering. Moving on, you do have the option to include grazing events. We're going to go over that in the pasture setting. So for crop, I'm not going to include a grazing event. And then lastly, the last management entry would be for liming, and then I'm going to hit save. This will bring us back out to the main baseline panel where you'll see a green check mark has appeared at the end of this row indicating that management is complete for the year 2012 because again, at minimum, we have a crop planted. If I wanted to add a second crop to this year, let's say I wanted to add perhaps winter wheat, one thing I want to point out is under planting and harvest, you'll see that our growing season for alfalfa is already included. And so I will not be allowed to enter winter wheat being planted anytime between January and February 15th. That will be grayed out in this calendar. COMET-Farm is unable to support more than one crop growing at a time, so that is one limitation. Now you can see how manually entering data for every single year in your baseline can be a little bit time consuming, so I am going to go through a shortcut. At the end of the row, you'll see an icon that looks at like two pieces of paper stacked on top of another. This is where you can copy your year's management to another year and another field in your baseline. So in this case, I'd be copying my alfalfa, and I can copy it not only between years, but also between fields. So on my crop field, I'm going to go every other year. I want that same alfalfa planted and I want it managed the same. When I hit save and copy, it'll pop us back out to the baseline and you'll see that my alfalfa is now populated for every other year all the way through 2024. Now it is important to note that you are copying a year's worth of management and not just a singular crop. So if I had planted that winter wheat as my second crop, both alfalfa and winter wheat and all the management associated with those would be copied to every other year in that baseline. Now I mentioned that first I'd be walking through how to manually add your management data, and then we'd be showing you a shortcut in the form of the crop rotation builder. The crop rotation builder consists of crops that have predefined management data for select dates. So that default data can include things like typical planting and harvest dates, typical dry matter removal percentages, fertilizer application, and stuff like that. So all you're going to do is select the crops that you'd like planted in what order that you'd like them planted. So in my case, I'm going to start with alfalfa. You opt whether or not that crop is going to be irrigated. So in this case, yes, I would like it irrigated. And then you select the tillage system intensity for either pre-planting or post-harvest or both. So in this case, my alfalfa is going to have full intensive till in pre-planting. Moving on to our second crop, we're going to create a rotation with corn and winter wheat. I would like that corn to be irrigated. I'm going to have full intensive tilled applied to the corn as well. And then my last crop in the rotation is going to be winter wheat. That winter wheat is also going to be irrigated. And so I'm just going to check that. And then I'm also going to have full intensive till applied to that winter wheat as well. Now it's important to note with the crop rotation builder that this is going to overwrite anything that you've done manually. So looking back at the baseline, we went through and I updated that alfalfa to have my management done manually. this crop rotation builder is going to overwrite that alfalfa, and it's going to be applied to the entire baseline in the order of a common rotation. So it is going to know that if I select alfalfa, corn, and winter wheat, it is going to be smart enough to know that winter wheat is a cover crop. And so it's going to overwrite the whole baseline in that order. When I hit save, it's going to pop us back out to the overall baseline management panel. We'll see that we have crops populated for 2012 through 2024. Every year has that green check indicating that it's complete. When we go into the alfalfa, you'll see that my planting and harvest dates were altered slightly. The tillage system intensity that I selected is applied, and then it looks like we don't have any fertilizer applied, but we do have irrigation. That is slightly different than when I did it manually myself. We can also go into corn, and we can see that kind of typical fertilizer application has been applied here, and that's totaled across fertilizer and organic amendments. It applied typical planting and harvest information, and so that was all done completely for me. Now that we see those green check marks indicating that management is complete, we have a few options. We can copy this entire rotation to another field. It's not applicable in this situation because our others are orchard and vineyards, but if we had another crop field, we could. Hitting review inputs allows you to see this entire table of management. You can also download it as a CSV file if you want it for your records, but you can go through and make sure the management is accurate. But in our case, we're going to go ahead and hit next, where we will replicate the same process, but for our other fields. And we're going to go ahead and start with our orchard. Our historic management is already complete, so we're just going to scroll back down to our baseline, and this will look similar, but a little bit different because it is an orchard. For our crop selection, we're going to scroll down to these woody crops, and we're going to do English walnuts. Again, orchard is the same in that the bare minimum is you need planting and harvest information. It is going to assume that your woody crop is planted without you assigning a specific planting date. It's just going to ask, did you prune and did you renew? An option here is to check out our need help widget, where it defines what renewing or clearing an orchard or vineyard might mean. So just a reminder that that need help widget is following you from page to page and always there with those answers. I'm going to say yes, I did prune, but I did not renew. I also have the option to replicate my tillage system intensity. In this case, I'm actually going to just apply a other field application in the form of broad spectrum herbicide. I'm going to do March 31st, and this is again 2012, so the first year in our baseline. Scrolling down, we'll look at our fertilizer and organic amendment. I am going to apply some fertilizer again in that kind of mid-March vicinity. For my fertilizer type, I'll opt for, I'll go over to April 1st, and for my fertilizer type, I'm going to select the element N, which essentially allows you to define the nitrogen applied without specifying the other information. So for the total amount of nitrogen here, I'll say 85 pounds per acre for total N applied, and that will be the same across total amount applied and total N applied because again, it is element N. I'll replicate this process for a few other dates. Again, I'm copying management that was provided by the Chico State Hypothetical Carbon Farm Plan. So we won't need to go over all of this in great detail, but yeah, just a few instances of fertilizer application. Then we'll move on to irrigation. We'll have our irrigation start in June and go through, let's say, the kind of beginning of September. For irrigation amount, I'm again going to stick with just 1 inch per application, and we'll do that weekly, so 6 days between application. And we'll go ahead and hit save. So slightly more simple than crop, but it does ask a little bit of different questions when it comes to that planting and harvest. Unlike the crop field, we're not doing any sort of rotation. We're just having the walnuts grow every year in the baseline. So here, rather than every other year, I'm going to select every year in my baseline and then hit save and copy. It'll again pop us out to our baseline. We'll get that green check for every year. English walnuts is replicated across all of those years, and we'll consider that one complete. Our last field is of course our pasture, so I'm going to go ahead and just use the crop rotation builder to at least get our baseline consisting of grass so that I don't have to do that manually. So I'm going to select grass. I know that I want it to be irrigated, and that's the only crop I want. I'm going to real quick go back over to our reference point to double check these pastures to see if they are tilled in any particular way or have another field operation. I'm not seeing it. I'm seeing that it's irrigated and that we get 5 tons of compost per year. And yes, again, irrigated pasture. Cool. So with that, I'm going to pop right back over to COMET-Farm. Irrigated but no tillage added. I'll hit save and that will populate our baseline with typical grass management. And then I'm going to go in and edit the fertilizer application. So I'm going to hit the pencil, go on down to fertilizer where some typical fertilizer was added based on the crop rotation builder. I can delete that because we know based on the carbon farm plan that we're using as reference that we want compost added. So I'm going to scroll down. I see compost and we want 5 tons added here. Those other values are defaulted based on the selection of compost. I'm going to keep it that way. Then I'm going to scroll down to grazing events. Because this is pasture and because we have an animal ag system in place as well, I am going to go ahead and include grazing events. I'm going to have this start at the end of the year, or go through the whole year, so from the first to the very end of the year. Our rest days are the days between grazing events, so I'm going to keep that at 20. And our daily utilization refers to how often your livestock are returning to the same square foot of grass and how much above ground biomass is being removed. So in this case, I'm saying that every 20 days, in this case, cattle are returning back to the same square foot and taking 3% of above ground biomass off. Now that I have my pasture management the way that I want it, I need to make sure to copy that to all the years in my baseline because that was just applied to 2012. So I'm going to use that copy button. I'm going to select all the years in my baseline and I'll hit save. Now I like to just double check and make sure everything is done. So I'm going to go back up to my select field. You'll see that all these green check marks indicate that all my fields have management added. This blue circle at the top indicates that field management is complete, and so we are good to proceed to scenario management, which will be our next video.